and we're back now with the panel. Rick, you know the power of images, and that image, which we've seen repeatedly today and over the past week, of 3-year-old Ilan Kurdi up on the beach like a piece of driftwood, really seemed to bring this problem into focus, didn't it?
It's amazing how most Americans, among others, were sleeping until we saw that one little boy, and it humanized things, and then over the pictures of the camp. I mean, this is the perfect storm of humanitarian disasters where there are all sorts of contributors. But one thing which I think has been not noted, this is also a national security problem of the first order. We stand to lose a generation of refugee kids who are not properly educated or employed. And this is where our fear of terrorism redoubles on itself. On one hand, we don't want these folks coming in because we worry about potential terrorism. On the other hand, this international failing of the first order is creating a whole generation of dislocated people, which could really be problematic in the very ways we fear most.
With this flood of refugees, Robert, you're seeing a very troubling split inside the European Union. Some of the richer countries, like Germany, have been very generous in accepting and sheltering refugees, but some of the countries that don't have that kind of money have been, and Hungary may be the prime example, one, have been much more reluctant to bring in refugees and are opposed to the EU's idea of setting quotas on how many migrants each country is going to take.
You're seeing countries, especially those that are having economic problems, they're not trying to bring in all of these migrants. At the same time, this issue is becoming more of one even in American politics. I checked in with the campaign and said, how are you handling this? Their first reaction is, it's a Barack Obama problem. It's President Obama's policy with Syria. But they expect the second debate that they have to have a policy idea ready. If Europe is not ready to handle this situation, what is the United States' role?
Well, and that's a really interesting question, Susan, because as Greg Palcott pointed out, so far the U.S. has accepted somewhere between 1,000 and 1,800 refugees from Syria in the last year. So the question is, do we accept more? And Rick talked about a national security aspect. There's also the national security aspect. If you start bringing in thousands of refugees, might some of them be terrorists?
Well, I suppose it's possible, although we recognize our obligation if people have a well-founded fear of persecution in their homeland, that they get some international rights and some humanitarian treatment. You can hardly argue that the people of Syria do not face a well-founded fear of persecution in their homeland. The United States has an obligation there. And if we expect countries in Europe to step up to the plate with this, surely the United States is going to be forced to step up in a more serious way than taking 1,000 or 1,500 Syrian refugees. There are, what, 4 million Syrian refugees? Much greater numbers are going to come here. And I would also say that the United States has been well served by previous waves of refugees that we've accepted, by the Vietnamese refugees that we accepted after the Vietnam War, who have become a great part of our nation. So we worry about terrorism. You can't look at these biblical pictures of people walking down miles and miles seeking just humanitarian treatment and not be touched.
George.
Well, first, yes, shortly after we took in 1 million refugees from Vietnam after Vietnam fell. About 10, 15 years later, there are a whole bunch of high school valedictorians named Nguyen all over California, so we benefited from immigrants there. One of the questions here is this our fault because of what happened in Syria? I don't think we started the Syrian war. I don't think we had civil war. I don't think we have a recipe for ending it. The real problem is Syria. Libya. A lot of the refugees from Syria come overland into Europe or on a much safer trip by water to Greece. The really dangerous trip is across the Mediterranean to Italy from Libya. In August 27th, 2 boats carrying 500 people from Libya sank. In April, 800 people drowned trying to get from Libya. Now, what happened to Libya? That is our fault. We went in a country that posed no conceivable threat to the United States, and in an 8-month protracted assassination attempt, decapitated their government, creating the failed state that today is producing all this. And some presidential candidates, both the former Secretary of State and some Republicans who were enthusiasts for the Libyan intervention, are going to have to answer for this. One further point. Some estimates are that as many as 500,000 refugees are now besieging Europe in the first 8 months of this year. That's 1/20th, actually less than 1/20th, of the number of human beings that Donald Trump proposes to deport.
Well, I have to wrap my mind around that for a minute. So are you saying that you think that the U.S. should be more proactive in bringing in refugees to this country, that we did it in the case of Vietnam and we can do it here?
Vietnam, we clearly had a particularly intense obligation because we'd fought a war, sought allies, and lost. But it is part of our national heritage to do our duty.
But I'm not sure there's a political appetite for that. I mean, I was just in Mobile, Alabama with Trump, covering Trump in Iowa. The people who are supporting the Republican frontrunner don't seem to be in that mindset. So it's going to be hard for a lot of these Republican contenders if they see the human condition here, but they also they're trying to win a primary. I don't see the voters pushing for this in the GOP.
Well, the president needs to step up. I mean, he's in office right now. He needs to talk about what he can do in terms of letting in migrants, of international aid, of even using the Sixth Fleet to stem this tragedy at sea that we have going on. But we also need the Arab Gulf states to come in. We need a coordinated response from Europe, led by Germany. You know, this is something which can't wait on politics. People need to step up now.
You know, you want to fuel terrorism? Don't do anything about this refugee. If you're worried about terrorists, just let the situation continue to fester.
But there's another aspect to that, and that is, and George alluded to it in addition to talking about Libya, which is Syria. I mean, Syria is a failed state, and it is bleeding its problems all across Europe. And, you know, we now hear the Russians may be coming into Syria. The slaughter of one ethnic religious group of another continues. So as long as that continues, isn't there going to be just a never-ending supply of these migrants around Europe and conceivably the United States, George?
Yes, there will. And if we had any way to stop the fighting in Syria, we should do it. But I don't think we do. Remember, at the end of the Second World War, there were about 15 million displaced people in Europe. 10 years later, there were essentially none. We've handled crises like this before. Now, this is different. The Europeans were displaced Europeans in Europe. And Europe doesn't have our tradition of assimilation of people from around the world. Europeans may have to learn a lesson from their transatlantic cousins, us, about how you do this.
And there's another aspect of this, Susan, because to the degree, and I'm not saying that the U.S. and Europe should shut the door, but to the degree that the U.S. and Europe open the door, doesn't that simply ensure that more refugees, more migrants will leave Syria, will leave Turkey, which is a country, you know, that they go to right across the border, and will follow in their footsteps?
We don't have a moral obligation to take everybody who wants to come to the United States. We do have a moral obligation to take people who are facing this kind of situation.
Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.